Usually, when we encounter an ancient Greek myth, the experience is, well, it's a lot like walking through a sterile, climate-controlled museum.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Like everything is safely behind glass.
Exactly. You look at a marble statue, maybe you read the little two-sentence brass plaque about the date it was carved, and you just acknowledge its historical significance, and then you simply move on to the next exhibit.
Because the artifact belongs to a dead world. I mean, it's completely cordoned off from our modern anxieties. It's securely categorized as just, antiquity.
Yeah, we totally strip away the blood, the terror, the desperate theology of the people who actually wrote these stories in the first place.
We just leave the aesthetic shell.
Right. But occasionally you take one of these ancient texts, like a narrative absolutely saturated with madness and human sacrifice and divine betrayal, and you pull it out of the museum.
You put it under a microscope.
A rigorous, modern theological microscope. And when you do that, the protective glass shatters. You realize you are no longer looking at a dusty relic. You're staring into this fiercely debated, intensely personal ideological landscape.
Which has profound implications for how people understand the universe today.
Exactly. So welcome to another deep dive. We have an incredibly complex, multi-layered challenge ahead of us for you today, because we're looking at two wildly divergent sources that have zeroed in on the exact same ancient text.
And divergent might be an understatement here. The chronological and philosophical whiplash between these two documents is, well, it's severe.
Totally. So our first source is this evocative, highly literary 1910 translation and scholarly preface of Euripides' ancient play Iphigenia in Tauris.
Put together by the classical scholar Gilbert Murray.
Right, Murray. And he treats the text as this masterpiece of human psychology and theatrical innovation. But then our second source is a highly dense, rigorously modern academic essay.
Yeah, and this essay takes that very same ancient pagan play and analyzes it from a strict, conservative, evangelical, canonical, biblical theology perspective.
Quite the jump.
Oh, massive. We're jumping from early 20th century classical literary appreciation directly into the deep end of 21st century theological exegesis. And, armed with advanced linguistic frameworks like discourse analysis and verbal aspect theory.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today is ambitious. First, we need to reconstruct this gripping ancient tale of exile, psychological trauma, and what essentially amounts to a divinely mandated art heist.
An art heist, exactly.
We have to feel the weight of this Greek tragedy for you listening, and then we have to transition into the minds of modern theological scholars. We need to understand exactly how they use this 2,400-year-old pagan play as a dramatic foil to illuminate the deepest themes of the biblical canon.
It's a fascinating comparison.
It really is. But before we dive into the blood-soaked altars of antiquity, I do want to establish some parameters for you listeners.
That's important.
We are going to be wading into intense religious and theological arguments today, specifically those stemming from our academic source. As your guides on this deep dive, our role is entirely neutral.
Completely.
We're mapping out the architecture of this scholar's argument impartially. We aren't taking sides, we aren't endorsing a specific theology, and we are definitely not preaching. We are simply exploring how a modern academic uses linguistic and thematic parallels to connect the worldview of Euripides to the worldview of the biblical authors.
That neutrality is paramount, really.
Yeah.
We are functioning as intellectual mechanics, I guess, opening the hood of this academic essay to see how the scholar's engine works.
Right.
We want to examine how they build their case piece by piece, relying on ancient Near Eastern history and granular grammar.
But the theology means nothing if we don't understand the story that provoked it in the first place. We have to immerse ourselves in the narrative first. So I was reading through Gilbert Murray's translation notes, and I was really struck by how scholars categorize Iphigenia in Tauris. Because when I hear Greek tragedy, my mind immediately goes to a stage just littered with bodies.
Right, the classic Shakespearean pile of doom.
Exactly. I expect a fatal flaw, a catastrophic downfall, an ending where literally everyone is dead, blind, or weeping. But our sources point out that this play doesn't fit that mold at all.
No, it defies the stereotypical tragic structure entirely. Euripides wrote this play somewhere between 414 and 412 BCE, and classical scholars actually classify it as an escape romance or a tragicomedy.
Okay, I always struggle with the term tragicomedy in an ancient context. I mean, it doesn't mean there are punchlines or comedic relief characters.
No, you won't find a laugh track here.
Yeah.
In classical terms, it signifies a narrative that deals with the darkest, most traumatic elements of human existence. Murder, exile, the threat of execution.
Hmm.
But ultimately, it steers toward a resolution that doesn't end in utter catastrophe.
It has a happy ending.
Essentially, yes. It's a story focused on recognition between lost loved ones and a daring rescue from a seemingly impossible situation.
Yet, reading through the Murray preface, you do not feel happy. The atmosphere is suffocatingly dark. And the source explains this through a concept classical scholars call an aetation.
An Asian yet.
When I looked into this, an Asian essentially functions as a mythological origin story, designed to explain a bizarre or disturbing local ritual. Like, why do we practice this weird tradition every year? Oh, because centuries ago, this specific mythological event happened.
That is the precise function of the play. Euripides isn't just writing entertainment here. He is providing the theological and historical justification for a specific religious observance.
Okay.
Murray highlights that Iphigenia in Tauris was written to explain a highly unusual, very specific ritual at a place called Halle in the region of Attica.
And this ritual is not just, offering a basket of fruit or burning some incense. It is a deeply unsettling physical act.
Very unsettling.
During this festival at Halle, a human victim is led up to the altar of the goddess Artemis. A priest approaches them with the sword, and the blade is actually drawn across the victim's throat, just enough to break the skin and draw a single drop of human blood. And then, the victim is released.
It's the literal simulation of a human sacrifice. The community brings a human being to the absolute precipice of death, fulfills the technical requirement of spilling human blood for the goddess, and then pulls back.
Wow.
Yeah. It is a legalistic loophole designed to appease a deity without actually losing a member of the community.
Which casts this massive, inescapable shadow over the entire play. The original Athenian audience sitting in the amphitheater watching this, they knew that this play was the foundational text for that throat-slitting ritual.
Exactly.
So even when the characters are making clever plans or experiencing moments of hope, the audience feels the cold steel of that knife. The threat of a sacrificial altar is the gravity of the entire narrative.
The architecture of the play is built on the anticipation of slaughter. You really cannot separate the escape romance from the terrifying reality of the altar.
So to understand how our protagonist ends up trapped in this nightmare, we need to rewind and look at the inciting incident of her life.
The backstory.
The backstory of Iphigenia is one of the most brutal betrayals in ancient literature. Her father is King Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces. He has assembled a massive armada at the port of Aulis, preparing to sail across the sea to wage the Trojan War. But they're trapped. The winds have completely died.
Not a breeze.
Right. The ships are stranded in the harbor, the men are getting restless, and the entire military campaign is collapsing before it even begins.
And we have to remember, in the cosmological framework of the ancient world, weather is not a meteorological phenomenon.
No.
It's a direct expression of divine will. If the winds stop, it means the gods are actively preventing your departure. You have offended them, and restitution must be made.
So Agamemnon consults his prophet, the medicine man Calchas. And Calchas delivers a devastating oracle. He claims the goddess Artemis is furious with Agamemnon, and to appease her and secure the winds, she demands a sacrifice.
But not just any sacrifice.
Right. She refuses cattle or sheep. She demands the blood of Agamemnon's eldest daughter, Iphigenia, and Agamemnon, who is just driven by this insatiable thirst for military glory, actually agrees.
He chooses ambition over his own child.
He decides his ambition is worth more than his child's life. But he knows he can't just forcefully drag her from her mother, so he orchestrates this sickening deception. He sends a royal decree back home, telling his wife and daughter to come to the military camp because he has arranged for Iphigenia to marry the greatest Greek warrior, Achilles.
The psychological cruelty of that deception cannot be overstated. Iphigenia travels to the military encampment believing she's entering the pinnacle of social elevation.
Yeah.
She is preparing for a joyous wedding celebration. Instead, the moment she arrives, she is seized, bound, and dragged to a bloody altar.
The Murray translation paints this agonizing picture. The priests are chanting, her father is standing there watching, and the blade is literally descending toward her throat. But at the final microsecond, Artemis intervenes.
The famous substitution?
Yes, the goddess snatches Iphigenia away, replacing her physical body on the altar with a bleeding, dying deer. The Greek army sees the blood, they assume the princess is dead, the winds pick up, and they sail off to war. But Iphigenia is alive. Artemis whisks her through the sky and abandons her in a remote, savage land called Tauris.
We have to understand what Tauris represented to the ancient Greek mind. Tauris was located on the Crimean Peninsula, along the shores of the Black Sea.
Okay.
To the Athenians, this was the absolute edge of the known world. It was a place beyond the friendless seas, a realm of utter barbarism, ruled by a savage king named Tauris. It represented everything antithetical to Greek civilization, order, and reason.
And you would think, after Artemis miraculously intervened to save Iphigenia from human sacrifice, the goddess might offer her a peaceful sanctuary. But the reality is a horrific irony.
A dark twist, yeah.
Our sources detail that in the land of Tauris, there is a primitive wooden image of Artemis that the locals believe fell directly from the heavens. And the foundational law of this land is that any foreigner, specifically any Greek who washes ashore, must be captured and sacrificed to this statue.
And who does Artemis appoint as the high priestess of this temple?
Iphigenia. The very woman traumatized by human sacrifice is now forced to be the chief administrator of it. Her sacred duty is to approach these terrified, shipwrecked Greeks, touch their hair, and ritually consecrate them for the slaughter.
It is a breathtaking inversion of her trauma. She is trapped in a cyclical nightmare, forced to perpetually inflict the exact horror that was inflicted upon her.
I found myself genuinely angry at the mythology here. I was wrestling with the text, thinking, is Artemis a savior or a tyrant?
It's ambiguous.
Very. She stops the blade at Aulis, which seems merciful, but then she drops Iphigenia into an existence entirely defined by butchering strangers. It feels like Artemis isn't rescuing her, she's just moving her to a different, bloodier cage.
Your frustration is precisely the reaction Euripides intended to provoke. Our academic source seizes on this very dynamic, highlighting it as a central critique embedded within the play. The pagan gods in this narrative are not paragons of justice or morality.
Clearly not.
They are inscrutable, capricious, and deeply ambiguous. They demand human blood to manipulate weather patterns, yet they capriciously rescue a victim, only to enslave that victim in a system of perpetual slaughter elsewhere. The theology of the play presents a universe governed by entities that you simply cannot trust.
It is a universe where the divine management is openly hostile to human flourishing. And this brings us to the psychological core of the play. We know the grim mechanics of Tauris. We know the bloody rules of the island. But what is happening inside the mind of our protagonist? Because Gilbert Murray makes it very clear in his preface that Iphigenia is not some passive weeping maiden waiting to be rescued.
Euripides was renowned in antiquity for his unflinching portrayal of complex, morally compromised women, and Iphigenia is a masterclass in this regard. Murray describes her as a, quote, haggard and exiled woman. Yeah. She defies the archetype of the pure, sympathetic heroine. The years of isolation and the unending flow of blood over her altar have fundamentally warped her.
She is consumed by this violent collision of emotions. On one side, she is experiencing this hollow, desperate homesickness. She yearns for the civilization of Greece, for her family, for the life she was promised. But simultaneously, she harbors a toxic, festering rage against the very people she misses.
The betrayal runs deep.
So deep. She is intensely bitter toward the Greek leaders who plotted her murder. Calchas, the prophet who demanded the blood, Odysseus, who facilitated the lie, Menelaus, whose stolen wife started the war, and her own father who held the knife. She has spent years stewing in this betrayal.
The trauma of Aulis is the gravitational center of her psychology. The altar is not just a memory. It is the lens through which she views all of humanity.
The sources detail an incredibly vivid, disturbing scene early in the play that brilliantly illustrates her mental state. Iphigenia recounts a nightmare she has just awoken from. In the dream, she is transported back to her home in Argos. She is sleeping peacefully among her maids. Suddenly, the earth violently fractures. A massive earthquake tears through the city, the ground heaves like the ocean, and she flees outside. She turns back just in time to watch her father's magnificent palace collapse into total ruin. The destruction of her past is absolute.
The architectural collapse is a potent metaphor for the annihilation of her family lineage, which is a recurring theme in Greek tragedy.
But the dream gets stranger and darker. Out of the dust and rubble of the ruined palace, a single, solitary oaken tiller remains standing. And as she watches, this wooden pillar undergoes a grotesque metamorphosis. It sprouts brown hair from its capital, it begins to weep, and it speaks to her with a human voice.
Very unsettling imagery.
Right. In the dream, Iphigenia, acting on pure conditioned instinct, walks up to this weeping pillar. She doesn't comfort it. Instead, she performs her Taurian priestly duty. She washes the pillar with water and blood, ritually consecrating it for death, weeping herself as she does it.
In ancient Greek culture, dreams were not viewed merely as the processing of subconscious anxieties. They were treated as heavily codified prophetic messages. They required intense scrutiny and interpretation.
And Iphigenia interprets this nightmare with devastating certainty. She believes the single surviving pillar represents the only remaining male heir of her house, her younger brother, Orestes. Because the pillar sprouted hair and spoke, she knows it is him. And because she, in her role as the priestess of death, washed the pillar in preparation for sacrifice, she concludes that Orestes must be dead. She believes the last tether to her humanity has been severed.
The psychological fallout of this interpretation is profound. The Murray translation captures the precise moment her empathy dies. She explicitly states that her heart has, quote, turned to stone.
She says she has absolutely no pity left. If any Greek sailors wash ashore now, she won't feel a shred of guilt. She is eager to send them to the slaughter, to subject them to the exact horror her people subjected her to.
A dark turning point.
When you look at this from a modern psychological perspective, the insight is just staggering. Euripides, writing 2.5 millennia ago, perfectly encapsulated how unhealed trauma operates. When profound betrayal and violence are left to fester in isolation, they metastasize. The victim develops a compulsion to recreate the trauma, but this time, playing the role of the executioner rather than the sacrifice.
Yes.
She wants to inflict pain because her own pain is unbearable.
It is the brutal mechanics of the cycle of violence, localized within the internal monologue of a single, deeply damaged character. She has weaponized her own suffering, convincing herself that she is entirely devoid of compassion.
But narrative structure demands that the moment a character declares they are invincible to emotion, the universe tests them.
Always.
Just as Iphigenia hardens her heart into stone, preparing to slaughter the next Greeks who arrive without a second thought, 2 Greeks wash ashore.
And the arrival of these specific Greeks accelerates the plot, from a simmering psychological study into a frantic, high-stakes thriller. The 2 men who arrive are Orestes. The very brother Iphigenia just dreamed was dead, and his fiercely loyal companion, Pylades.
We have to spend some time on Orestes because this character is enduring an unimaginable level of psychological torment. He's a man utterly broken by his own family's curse. He isn't on an exploratory voyage. He is a fugitive fleeing the Furies.
For those unfamiliar with the deeper cuts of Greek mythology, the Furies, or Erinyes, are ancient chthonic deities of vengeance. They predate the Olympian gods. Their specific domain is punishing those who spill the blood of their own family.
And Orestes definitely did that.
He did. Orestes is being relentlessly pursued by them because he committed matricide. He murdered his own mother, Clytemnestra, in retaliation for her murdering his father, Agamemnon.
It is the ultimate toxic family dynamic. Every generation slaughters the previous one. Orestes is driven to the brink of total insanity by these invisible, tormenting deities. In desperation, he goes to the Oracle of Delphi to beg the god Apollo for a cure to his madness, and Apollo gives him what sounds like a suicide mission.
A completely impossible task.
Apollo commands Orestes to travel to the end of the earth, to the barbarian land of Tauris, infiltrate the temple of Artemis, steal the sacred water statue that fell from heaven, and transport it back to Athens.
It is, as you mentioned earlier, a divinely mandated art heist. The theological premise is that only by relocating the sacred image can Orestes cleanse his blood guilt and silence the Furies.
But Orestes and Pylades are walking directly into a death trap. They arrive on the shores of Tauris, fully aware that the local law mandates the sacrifice of any Greek. They hide in a sea cave, waiting for the cover of darkness to attempt the heist. But they are discovered. The way our source text translates the herdsman's account of finding the 2 Greeks is arguably one of the most cinematic sequences in ancient literature.
The pacing and imagery Euripides employs here are incredibly vivid. The narrative shifts to the perspective of the local Taurian herdsmen who are down at the shoreline, washing their cattle in the sea.
One of the herdsmen spots the 2 men hiding in the shadows of the cave. The psychological isolation of the Taurians is immediately apparent. They are so thoroughly disconnected from the broader Mediterranean world that the sight of 2 handsome, well-dressed Greek men doesn't register as a human encounter.
They think they're gods.
Right. The herdsman drops to his knees in terror, praying to them. He assumes they are supernatural entities, perhaps sea spirits or the divine twin sons of Zeus.
This reaction underscores the profound otherness between the cultures. To the barbarian herdsman, the civilized Greek appears terrifyingly divine.
But another herdsman, a man the text describes as flushed with folly and practical to a fault, laughs at his friend. He says, "They aren't gods, they're just shipwrecked sailors. Let's capture them." The priestess needs fresh blood for the bowl. The herdsmen begin to surround the cave. But before they can launch an attack, Orestes experiences a massive, catastrophic psychological break.
His trauma catches up with him.
The text describes him suddenly convulsing. His PTSD, manifested as the Furies, overtakes him entirely.
The language translated from the Greek is deeply visceral. Orestes doesn't just panic. He suffers a full hallucinatory collapse. He screams that he is being attacked by a, quote, she-dragon of hell.
The imagery he yells out is terrifying. He hallucinates a monster with fanged asps writhing in its hair, breathing a hurricane of fire and bloody smoke. He genuinely believes this demon is trying to crush him to death using the petrified corpse of his murdered mother.
It's pure psychological horror.
Driven by this terrifying hallucination, he draws his sword and charges out of the cave. But there are no Furies. There are only the herdsmen and their cattle. Orestes, completely detached from reality, wades into the herd of cows and begins hacking them to pieces, genuinely believing he is fighting the demons of hell. The text describes the sea foam turning crimson with the blood of the slaughtered livestock. It is a scene of absolute chaotic brutality.
The fit of madness eventually exhausts him. The hallucination breaks, and Orestes collapses to the sand, physically weakened, trembling and foaming at the mouth. This moment of extreme vulnerability is where Euripides masterfully contrasts Orestes with his companion, Pylades.
Pylades exhibits a level of loyalty that is staggering. While Orestes is incapacitated on the ground, the Taurian herdsmen realize he isn't a god and he isn't a demon. He's just a sick, dangerous man. They rally, form a mob, and begin hurling stones at him from a safe distance. Pylades has every opportunity to run.
He could easily escape.
But he doesn't. He drops to his knees in the center of this rock-throwing mob. He gently wipes the foam from Orestes' mouth, and he physically covers his friend's body with his own cloak, absorbing the impact of the stones to shield Orestes from further harm.
It is a stunning visual representation of devotion. And this specific action introduces a conceptual framework that our academic source identifies as a critical thematic pillar of the play, the Greek concept of philia.
I want to dig into philia. We often translate it simply as friendship or brotherly love, but my understanding is that in ancient Greek philosophy, it carries a much heavier, almost structural weight within society.
That's correct. Philia is not merely an emotional affinity. It is a profound binding obligation of loyalty, mutual protection, and shared identity.
Like a pact.
Yes, it encompasses the bonds of blood relatives, but it also extends to the deepest of friendships, forging alliances that are stronger than fear or self-preservation. Our analytical source emphasizes that Orestes and Pylades are the absolute embodiment of ideal philia. They represent a noble, unselfish, heroic bond.
And Euripides uses this profound display of philia to draw a sharp, ironic contrast with the Taurians. The Greeks are historically categorized as the civilized culture, yet Orestes is the one acting like a rabid beast, slaughtering livestock in a hallucination. Meanwhile, the Taurians are the barbarians, yet they are acting defensively, trying to protect their community and their property from a violent madman.
It is a deliberate blurring of the lines between civilization and savagery. However, the contrast solidifies when we examine their motivations. The Greeks, despite the madness, are ultimately fighting for each other. Pylades risks his life out of pure philia. The Taurians, conversely, are not fighting out of love or loyalty to one another. They are mobilizing as a collective mob to enforce a rigid, unyielding law of ritualistic violence. They want captives for the Blood Bowl.
Eventually, the sheer numbers overwhelm the two Greeks. Exhausted and battered, their swords are beaten out of their hands, and they are taken prisoner. The Taurian king, Tauris, orders the men to be taken directly to the temple. They are to be handed over to the high priestess so she can consecrate them for the human sacrifice.
The reunion is set.
They are marching straight toward a fatal reunion with Iphigenia.
This complex narrative architecture, the collision between the deep bonds of Greek philia, the psychological trauma of exile, and the horrific demands of barbarian ritual violence, is not just an engaging theatrical setup. This exact matrix of themes is the foundation upon which our modern theological scholars build their analysis.
Right.
It is the bridge connecting the 5th century BCE amphitheater to the ancient Near East and ultimately to the biblical text.
And this is where we transition into the second half of our mission. We have the mythological narrative firmly in our minds. Now, we are bringing in our second source, the highly dense, rigorously academic essay.
The deep end of the pool.
Exactly. As we established at the top of the deep dive, this author is operating from a strict, canonical, evangelical perspective. Their goal is not literary appreciation. Their goal is theological comparison. They are searching for and aggressively analyzing the thematic and structural echoes between this pagan myth and the scriptures of the biblical canon.
The methodology here is vital to understand. The academic source is not arguing for what scholars call direct literary dependence. They are not suggesting that the author of the book of Hebrews had a scroll of Iphigenia in Tauris open on their desk.
Right. Nobody is accusing anyone of plagiarism.
Exactly. What they are arguing is that both of these texts emerged from the same broad, interconnected conceptual universe of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. They were, in essence, swimming in the same cultural water.
I think cultural water is the perfect phrase. When you look at the ancient world, whether you're in Greece or the Levant or Egypt, humanity was collectively terrified of the same things. They were all wrestling with the terrifying power of nature, the perceived anger of the divine, and the desperate need to appease that anger through blood.
The academic essay points out that the barbarian ritual violence depicted in Tauris reflects broader Greek anxieties and ethnographic stereotypes regarding ancient Near Eastern otherness. The historian Herodotus frequently cataloged the bizarre and violent practices of non-Greek peoples to highlight the supposed superiority of Greek reason.
When I was looking into the historical context the academic source provides, it highlighted that the Taurian practice of human sacrifice, while a mythological extreme, loosely parallels actual historical practices in the surrounding regions. Specifically, the source points to Canaanite and Phoenician practices of child sacrifice.
Yes.
These were real documented rituals where children were offered to deities like Molech to secure agricultural fertility or military victory. And these are the exact same practices that the biblical texts, which were written in that very same ancient Near Eastern environment, explicitly and repeatedly condemn with absolute horror.
The source's overarching argument is this. Euripides and the biblical authors were gazing at the exact same terrifying realities of the ancient world. The demand for sacrifice, the agony of exile, the desperate need for divine intervention. They were grappling with identical human questions, but the answers they arrived at, the theologies they constructed to make sense of the terror, are fundamentally and incompatibly different.
To demonstrate this fundamental incompatibility, the academic source doesn't just speak in broad philosophical strokes. It places specific narratives side by side. It takes the mythological scenes from Euripides and juxtaposes them directly against key texts from the Old Testament. And it starts with the most glaring, impossible to ignore parallel in the entire study, the narrative of a narrowly avoided human sacrifice.
Yes.
On one side, we have Iphigenia at Aulis. On the other side, we have the story of Abraham and Isaac from Genesis chapter 22.
The structural similarities between the two narratives are indeed striking. In both accounts, a patriarch is commanded by a deity to sacrifice his own child. In both accounts, the child is unwittingly led to the location of the sacrifice and placed upon the altar.
It's so similar.
And in both accounts, at the absolute climax of the tension, as the instrument of death is about to fall, the deity abruptly intervenes, halting the execution and providing a substitute animal in the child's place. A deer for Iphigenia, a ram caught in a thicket for Isaac.
A surface-level reading might look at those two stories and conclude, oh, they are basically the same myth told by two different cultures. But the academic source aggressively rejects that conclusion.
Oh, completely.
The scholar drills down into the micro-level grammar of the ancient Hebrew text to prove that the theological meaning of the substitution in Genesis is the exact opposite of the substitution in the Greek myth.
This is where the source's exegesis becomes incredibly granular, relying on advanced linguistic analysis. The scholar examines the Hebrew text of Genesis 22, focusing heavily on a specific grammatical structure known as the wa consecutive chain.
Let's slow down here because wa consecutive sounds like an incredibly intimidating piece of academic jargon. I need you to translate what that actually means for someone who has never studied biblical Hebrew. How does a wa consecutive function in a story?
I can break that down. In biblical Hebrew narrative poetry and prose, the wa consecutive, often referred to as the exegetical form, is a highly specific verb structure used to sequence the primary events of a story. If you imagine a narrative as a train, the wa consecutives are the engine and the coupling mechanisms driving the story forward.
Okay, that makes sense.
It roughly translates to and then, and then, and then. It's the grammatical marker that tells the reader, pay attention, this is the mainline foregrounded action, everything else is just background detail.
If I can try an analogy here, it's like how a film director uses camera lenses. The background details, the descriptions of the mountain or the altar are shot with a wide-angle lens. But when the director wants to show the absolute climax of the scene, they switch to a tight, focused close-up. The wa consecutive is the linguistic equivalent of that tight close-up, forcing the reader to look exactly where the author wants them to look.
That is an excellent analogy. The grammar directs the theological focus. The academic source demonstrates that in the climax of Genesis 22, the wa consecutive chain is deliberately deployed to highlight the divine intervention. The grammatical spotlight is violently shifted from Abraham's raised knife directly to the voice of the angel calling from heaven and the subsequent provision of the ram.
And what theological conclusion does the source draw from that grammatical spotlight?
The crucial distinction the source makes is about the nature of the deity's desire. In the biblical account, the text makes it unequivocally clear that God explicitly rejects the human offering. The provision of the ram is not a legalistic loophole. It is a sovereign, absolute repudiation of human sacrifice. God does not want Isaac's blood. The test was about Abraham's allegiance, not God's appetite for human life.
Contrast that with Artemis at Aulis. Artemis intervenes and saves Iphigenia, yes, but she still physically demands the blood of the deer on the altar. And more importantly, she establishes the nightmarish ritual in Tauris, where human blood must continually be spilled. Artemis doesn't reject human sacrifice, she institutionalizes it. She just negotiates a sneaky swap for this one specific princess.
Precisely. The source argues that the biblical God finds the practice of human sacrifice inherently abhorrent, pointing to texts like Leviticus 18:21, which categorically condemn the passing of children through the fire. The Greek gods, however, utilize human sacrifice as a valid metric for appeasement.
To further hammer home this point about the biblical text's rejection of human sacrifice, the source brings up another Old Testament narrative, the deeply unsettling story of Jephthah in Judges chapter 11.
Jephthah's narrative is one of the most tragic in the Hebrew Bible. He is a military commander who, prior to a crucial battle, makes a rash, unprompted vow to God. He declares that if God grants him victory, he will sacrifice as a burnt offering whatever is the first to come out of the doors of his house to meet him when he returns in triumph.
He assumes it will be a sheep or a goat, but he wins the battle, returns home, and the first thing to come out of his house is his only child, his daughter, dancing with tambourines to celebrate his victory. Because of his rigid adherence to his foolish vow, he sacrifices her. It's a horrific story.
It is horrific, and the academic source uses it to highlight a vital difference in narrative framing. In Euripides' play, the sacrifice of a daughter is presented as a dark, terrifying, but ultimately accepted reality of how the cosmos operates. The gods demand it, and humans must comply. However, the source argues that the biblical narrative frames Jephthah's act not as a divine requirement, but as a catastrophic failure of human understanding. The text of Judges does not state that God demanded the vow, nor does it state that God approved of the sacrifice. It is presented as a horrifying consequence of a man trying to manipulate God using pagan transactional methods.
I found this section of the academic essay incredibly persuasive regarding the differing views of sacrifice. But here's where it gets really interesting. As I kept reading, I hit a section where I fundamentally struggled with the scholar's critique. I have to push back on the essay's dismissal of human agency in the play.
Okay, let's hear it.
If we look at the narrative of Iphigenia in Tauris, Orestes and Iphigenia don't just sit around waiting to die. They use their intense bond of philia, they outsmart the barbarian King Thoas with a brilliant deception, they successfully steal the statue, and they fight their way onto a ship to win their freedom. It's a triumph of the human spirit. Why does the academic source critique a story where human cleverness and loyalty actually defeat a terrible system? Isn't a happy ending driven by human agency a fundamentally good thing?
I understand the instinct to cheer for the protagonists. To a modern humanistic ear, a story where the characters outwit their oppressors and win their own freedom is deeply satisfying. It resonates with our belief in self-determination.
Right.
However, we must view this through the specific lens of our academic source. From a conservative, evangelical, canonical perspective, relying entirely on human cleverness, pulling off a heist in a universe governed by ambiguous, capricious deities is not triumphant. It is ultimately fatalistic and terrifying.
I'm not sure I follow that logic. How is winning your freedom fatalistic?
The source argues that if your survival, your salvation, is entirely dependent on whether you are clever enough to outsmart a deity or lucky enough to catch a deity on a day when they feel merciful, then you possess no true objective security. The gods of Euripides' play are fundamentally unreliable.
That's true.
Artemis demands blood one moment and orchestrates an escape the next. Apollo sends Orestes into a death trap, and Athena only intervened at the very end to clean up the mess. The evangelical critique posits that a polytheistic universe, driven by divine whims and human manipulation, offers no firm foundation for ultimate justice or permanent redemption. Your survival is merely a matter of luck and cunning.
I see. So from the biblical perspective, you don't want a universe where you have to rely on a lucky heist. You want a universe governed by an intentional, sovereign plan. You don't want luck. You want providence.
Exactly. The source is highlighting the theological exhaustion of the Greek worldview. It contrasts the frantic, human-driven, desperate escape of Orestes with the biblical concept of a sovereign God who purposefully orchestrates history toward a definitive redemption.
And speaking of frantic escapes and heists, the academic source takes a massive leap forward in the biblical timeline. They don't just contrast the play with the Old Testament. They find an incredibly specific, shocking structural parallel to Orestes' statue-stealing mission in the New Testament. And it involves a literal citywide riot over a statue of a goddess.
The essay draws a fascinating direct parallel between the plot of Iphigenia in Tauris and the historical events recorded in Acts chapter 19. The narrative in Acts follows the Apostle Paul as he travels to the city of Ephesus to preach the Christian gospel. Ephesus, significantly, was the epicenter of worship for the goddess Artemis in the ancient world. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
So we're dealing with the exact same deity. The goddess who demanded Iphigenia's blood at Aulis is the same goddess dominating the economy of Ephesus centuries later.
The continuity is remarkable. In Acts 19, the text describes a powerful guild of silversmiths operating in Ephesus, led by a man named Demetrius. This guild generates massive wealth by manufacturing and selling small silver shrines and statues of Artemis to pilgrims. Paul's preaching, specifically his assertion that deities made with human hands are not true gods, directly threatens their theological worldview. But more urgently, it threatens their supply chain and their economic survival.
Follow money.
Exactly. In response, Demetrius incites a violent, massive, citywide riot. A mob drags Paul's companions into the amphitheater, frantically defending the honor and the commercial viability of the goddess's image.
The structural mirror is undeniable. In Euripides' play, the entire plot hinges on a daring heist to steal the sacred image of Artemis from a barbarian temple. In Acts 19, the narrative hinges on a violent, mob-driven defense to protect the sacred image of Artemis from a new theological movement. Both texts revolve entirely around the cultural and spiritual tension generated by a physical statue of the same goddess.
But the academic source doesn't stop at pointing out the thematic similarity. The scholar applies 2 highly specialized linguistic frameworks to the Greek text of Acts 19 to demonstrate how the biblical author constructed the narrative. They utilize Hallidean discourse analysis and Campbell's verbal aspect theory.
Okay, we survived the explanation of the Hebrew law consecutive. Now we need to tackle the Greek linguistics. Let's start with Hallidean discourse analysis. I read the definition in the essay and it felt very dense. Can we find a way to explain how this actually functions in the text of Acts 19 without getting lost in the academic weeds?
We can absolutely make it accessible. At its core, Hallidean discourse analysis is the study of cohesion. It examines how sentences are glued together to create cumulative meaning across an entire text. It looks closely at lexical chains, the deliberate repetition of specific words or thematic concepts. The academic source meticulously maps out how the author of Acts 19 employs extraordinarily high cohesion to simulate the psychological experience of a riot.
So it's not just describing a riot. The grammar itself is rioting. If I can try another analogy here, it's like listening to a political demagogue whip a crowd into a frenzy. The speaker doesn't use complex, varied vocabulary. They use the same 3 or 4 emotionally charged buzzwords, repeating them over and over, increasing the volume and the tempo until the crowd is chanting along. The repetition bypasses logic and generates pure emotional momentum.
That is exactly how the lexical chains function in Acts 19. The source highlights how the text relentlessly repeats words like Artemis, temple, silver, image, and greatness. The text notes that the mob mindlessly chanted "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians" for 2 solid hours. The dense repetition of these specific nouns creates a linguistic semantic field that feels suffocating and chaotic.
Wow.
This grammatical frenzy is then sharply contrasted by the source against the calm, focused linguistic markers used to describe Paul's message, which the text simply and repeatedly refers to as the way.
The linguistic structure perfectly mirrors the theological clash. The chaotic, repetitive frenzy of the Artemis cult versus the singular, ordered focus of the new Christian theology. That is a brilliant piece of textual analysis. But what about the second framework, Campbell's verbal aspect theory? What is the scholar looking at there?
Verbal aspect is a fascinating concept in ancient Greek. While tense tells you when an action happened, past, present, or future aspect tells you how the author views the internal structure of the action. Does the author view the event as an ongoing, unfolding process, or do they view it from the outside as a single completed whole?
So it's the difference between saying I was walking to the store, which emphasizes the process, versus I walked to the store, which just states the completed fact.
Exactly. The academic source points out that when the riot finally explodes in Acts 19, the biblical author uses a specific Greek tense form called the aorist, specifically the word egeneto, meaning it happened or it arose. According to this linguistic framework, the aorist encodes a perfective aspect. It views the action as a complete, decisive event.
And why does that matter for the theology?
Because the aorist foregrounds the onset of the conflict. It tells the reader that this riot isn't just background noise or a temporary disagreement. The grammar marks the riot as a definitive, complete clash between the old pagan order desperately clinging to its silver statues and the definitive arrival of the new Christian message. The grammar insists this is a permanent historical pivot point.
The level of detail the academic source goes into is staggering. They are using the microscopic tense of a single verb to prove a massive theological shift away from the world of Euripides. But the source doesn't stop at Acts. The essay moves to its final textual comparison, and this is where the theological critique reaches its absolute apex. They turn to the book of Hebrews to directly attack the bloody ritual mechanics of Tauris.
This final comparison focuses heavily on the concept of repetition versus finality. The source asks us to look at the daily reality of Iphigenia in Tauris. Her existence is defined by an exhausting, inescapable cycle. A ship crashes, she prepares the victims, the blood is spilled, she washes the altar, she washes her hands, and then she waits for the next ship to crash so she can do it all over again.
Over and over.
The ritual never actually solves the underlying problem of divine anger. It merely resets the clock.
It's an endless treadmill of violence. She can never spill enough blood to make Artemis permanently satisfied. And the academic source contrasts that endless pagan cycle with the theological argument made in Hebrews chapters 9 and 10 regarding the sacrifice of Christ.
The essay zeroes in on a very specific Greek word used repeatedly in Hebrews.
Ephigenia.
The source translates that as once for all. Yes, once for all. The author of Hebrews pairs this word with another perfective aorist verb, isolthen, meaning he entered. The text states that Christ entered the holy place epipax, once for all. The academic source sets up a stark, structural dichotomy. On one side of the ledger, you have the pagan system represented by Tauris, an endless loop of repeated insufficient human sacrifices that perpetuate trauma and provide no lasting peace.
Right.
On the other side, you have the theology of Hebrews, a singular, definitive, unrepeatable, substitutionary atonement.
I want to use a modern, mechanical metaphor to illustrate what the scholar is arguing here. Imagine the guilt and the blood debt in the ancient world is like a massive computer virus corrupting a system. The pagan ritual of Tauris is like a user sitting at the keyboard manually deleting spam emails one by one every single day. It's exhausting, it never ends, and the virus is still there. But the concept of Epipax, the once-for-all sacrifice detailed in Hebrews, is pitched by the source as a root-level firewall update. It permanently alters the foundational code of the system. You execute the program once, and the virus is eradicated permanently.
That metaphor perfectly encapsulates the theological relief the source identifies in the biblical text. The essay argues that the once-for-all solution is structurally, logically, and theologically superior to the endless, bloody loop of pagan appeasement. It offers a permanent cessation of the violence that so profoundly traumatized Iphigenia.
Which brings us to the final grand synthesis of this academic essay. We have navigated the mythological narrative, the psychological trauma, the ancient Near Eastern context, the Hebrew grammar of Genesis, the Greek linguistics of Acts, and the theology of Hebrews. How does the scholar pull all of these threads together to issue their final verdict on Euripides' play?
I must reiterate our neutral framing here. We're outlining the conclusion of the source, not declaring an objective truth.
Right.
The academic source concludes with a forceful synthesis, arguing that when the biblical canon is applied as a diagnostic tool, it exposes the thematic core of Iphigenia in Tauris as fundamentally theologically bankrupt.
That is an incredibly strong, provocative phrase. Theologically bankrupt. How exactly do they justify that claim? I know the essay breaks this down into three main pillars of critique. Let's look at the first pillar.
The first pillar of the critique attacks the nature of the divine. The source argues that the pantheon depicted in the play, specifically Artemis, Apollo, and Athena, are capricious, morally ambiguous, and ultimately unreliable. They manipulate human suffering for their own obscure purposes. They demand human slaughter, but also orchestrate escapes from it without consistency or apparent justice.
And the contrast.
In stark contrast, the source posits that the Yahweh of the biblical text is presented as sovereign, consistently just, and fundamentally good. The biblical God, as demonstrated in the Isaac narrative, explicitly rejects the gamification of human life and the demand for literal human blood as a mechanism for appeasement.
The second pillar of the academic critique focuses on how the universe actually operates. It's the conflict between fate and providence.
Yes. In the Greek cosmological worldview, even the highest gods are subject to the blind, immovable force of fate. Because humans cannot know fate, they are forced to rely on oracular determinism, deciphering cryptic prophecies and sheer dumb luck. Orestes simply has to gamble his life that the Oracle of Delphi wasn't lying to him.
Not a great system to live under.
No.
No.
The source contrasts this terrifying uncertainty with the biblical concept of providence. The essay points specifically to texts like Romans 8:28, arguing that the biblical universe is not guided by blind fate or the whims of a wooden statue, but by the purposeful, redemptive, and intentional providence of a sovereign creator.
And the third pillar of the critique is the one we touched on earlier, the one I initially struggled with. The role of human ingenuity versus grace.
This is the most deeply theological and perhaps the most uniquely evangelical element of the critique. The play Iphigenia in Tauris is ultimately a celebration of human effort. Orestes, Pylades, and Iphigenia survive because they use their intelligence, their capacity for deception, and their profound bond of philia to pull off the heist. They save themselves.
Right.
The academic source acknowledges that this human effort, particularly the loyalty of Pylades, is noble. However, from a strict evangelical perspective, human effort is deemed ultimately insufficient for true salvation. The source argues that true cosmic redemption cannot be achieved through a clever heist, a tactical lie, or even the deepest human friendships. It points to faith and divine grace as the only superior solution, asserting that human exertion must ultimately yield to the finished, once-for-all work of Christ.
It's a comprehensive, systematic dismantling of the Greek worldview. But as we reach the end of this deep dive, I think it's vital to step back and ask a fundamental question. Why should you, the listener, care about this? Why did we just spend an hour listening to a 21st century academic tear apart a 2,400-year-old play using ancient grammar? It can sound like an incredibly niche, disconnected intellectual exercise.
It's a fair question. The value lies in recognizing the continuity of human anxiety.
Exactly. When you strip away the togas, the ancient Greek vocabulary, and the mythological statues, what are these texts actually arguing about? They are wrestling with the exact same massive, terrifying questions that keep people awake at night today. How do we break the cycles of violence in our societies? What do we do with profound, unhealed trauma like the rage that turned Iphigenia's heart to stone? And ultimately, who or what is really in control of our fate? Is it our own cleverness? Is it blind luck? Or is there a purposeful architecture to the universe?
Looking closely at contrasting texts is how we clarify our own deeply held values. The academic source uses the bankrupt, cyclical violence of the Taurian ritual as a dark background to make the concept of grace and once-for-all atonement in its own tradition shine brighter by comparison. Similarly, Euripides used the terrifying barbarian practices of Tauris to highlight the supposed superiority of Greek civilization and philia. We only truly understand what we believe by rigorously contrasting it with what we don't.
It has been a massive, wild intellectual journey today. We started by visualizing a cinematic, blood-soaked beach battle with a hallucinating Greek prince hacking at livestock. We ventured deep into the traumatized psychology of an exiled priestess washing a bleeding pillar in a nightmare. We explored the philosophical weight of Greek philia, and we ended up doing intense, granular grammatical dissection of ancient Hebrew walk consecutive chains and Greek aorist verbs to understand the theology of the New Testament.
Which I think beautifully demonstrates the incredible, enduring vitality of these ancient texts. They're not dead artifacts safely locked behind museum glass. They're still actively generating intense debate, still demanding that we analyze their grammar, and still forcing us to answer the profound questions they raise about the human condition.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. Consider the core narrative of Euripides' escape romance. The heroes are trapped in a nightmare, and to find peace and cure their madness, they literally have to execute a heist to steal a god world. They have to steal a physical statue from a hostile world. Think about the media, the movies, the novels you consume today. How many of our modern, multi-million-dollar blockbusters are really just secular variations of Orestes and Iphigenia? We are constantly drawn to stories of broken, traumatized people who realize the system is corrupt and who must rely entirely on their own cleverness and their found family, their modern philia, to pull off one last desperate heist to steal back their freedom from a hostile universe.
It is a narrative template that relies entirely on human agency, and it has absolutely never lost its psychological power over audiences.
It really hasn't. We love the heist because we desperately want to believe our own cleverness can save us.
Yeah.
So, the next time you sit down to watch a thriller about a group of friends trying to escape an impossible situation, ask yourself, what statue are they really trying to steal? What is the object, the achievement, or the escape that they believe will finally permanently cure their madness and bring them peace? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.